things that if you don't know the history of this, you're not necessarily going to even understand what it's talking about. So in this case, part of the argument is that, you had very small populations of tribes that would own large tracts of land. And so a lot of the land wasn't developed, right? The land was left forest and hunting areas. And so, this idea that whites have, especially this idea of manifest destiny. Oh, sorry, I'm uploading another movie and it just popped up. This idea of manifest destiny um, is that we are meant to take over the rest of the continent because it is God's will that we do it. And one of the arguments you see made is the idea that the savages do not develop the land in a way that is appropriate, right? It's just kind of going to waste, and God doesn't want us to let the land go to waste. He wants us to go in there and make something of it, right? Again, what is your evidence of that, right? I don't think, we see a whole lot of places in the Bible where God is saying, like, go in there and cut down all the trees and, stuff like that. But so that is one of the justifications they give in taking this land. Like, well, look at these Indians. They're just not doing anything with this land. They could be farming, and we could build a town here and that kind of stuff, right? So again, right now they want to say we can put a lot of people there and develop this land, right? And then he says that if we do that, right, if we actually move in people, right, and set up civilization, then that's also going to be another protection on the frontier. So in recent times, just recently before he gave this, there had been a couple of incidents where on the frontier, there had been skirmishes where settlers lost their lives, right? So this could have been tribes from outside of the boundaries of the United States. It could have been foreign governments because, Mexico is still really out in this area. But again, so here's the argument. Well, yeah, I'll be able to build up the population and provide more protection, right? But again, don't go out there if you're worried about being protected, right? And again, who knows that this will actually repel future invasions without remote aid. So remote aid basically was that they're not going to have to wait for the federal government to send troops out there. And this has always been a problem with Americans in the early part of settling this continent, that when they were first sent over here as colonies from Britain or Spain or France, whatever, right, a problem would happen and they would have to send for help over in England, but it might take 6, 7, 8, 9 months to get a response back. And they'd be, at the mercy of things. And so America quickly became a country where people didn't wait to ask for permission, that they started asserting their own authority because they just couldn't wait to get information back from whoever had founded or funded the colony, right? And so we have the same kind of thought here, right? Okay, we need people there that are going to immediately be able to handle the situation, not, have to wait. And think about this, 1830. This isn't that old. We're not that old yet into the country, right? And so people would remember, a lot of incidences of being kind of abandoned and isolated and not having, the security you need, right? And it says here, it will relieve, so here's another reason, it will relieve the whole state of Mississippi and the western part of Alabama of Indian occupancy. Well, okay, that is true, right? And enable those states to advance rapidly in population, wealth, and power. So, okay, we get rid of the Indians, we move in the white people, and all of a sudden we're going to have bigger population, we're going to have more money, and we're going to have more power. Well, certainly population, obviously, you got a lot of people wanting land. And that's one of the things, not only, Jackson's hatred of Native Americans, but you had a lot of pressure of white settlers who the cities were getting crowded. There wasn't enough land to go around, and people were demanding opportunities. They were demanding a chance at the American dream, right? And then they would also see some of the tribes, especially like the Cherokee, that had taken on the manners and the customs of the white world in order to try to fit in order to try to show that, hey, we're not that different. And so they had incredible towns, plantations, large farms, beautiful homes, and all of that. And this made some white people very jealous. Like, well, why do they have all of that and I have nothing, right? So the government is feeling more and more pressure from the common man to make land available, right? Now you think, well, why didn't they just send them west of the Mississippi? Well, they eventually do, right? When there's no more land in the east of the Mississippi, then that's when we start coming out and we have the land run, right? That kind of stuff. There's a song by the Eagles called The Last Frontier. And, it's kind of about that. We keep sending people around, but eventually we're going to run out. There is no more frontier, right? What are we going to do? And so right now we just keep sending people farther and farther out west. So here, how can they tell that it's going to increase wealth and power? Can't really promise that, right? So again, this is illogical that he's promising us that and it's like just because the Indians are there, that's the only thing keeping us from these things, right? Yeah. It will separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites, free them from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way and under their own rude institutions, will retard the progress of decay, which is lessening their numbers, and perhaps cause them gradually, under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsel, to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. Oh boy, there's a whole lot going on in that sentence, right? So first of all, okay, so the problem's going to happen because we're going to remove them from whites, right? Well, that's not really what happens because there's still forts out in Oklahoma, right? And it says it's going to free them from the power of the states. No. If it freed them from the states, they'd be able to roam wherever they wanted. No, they had to stay where they were put, right? So that's not true. It would enable them to pursue happiness in their own way and under their own rude institutions. Well, okay, they're already pursuing happiness in their own way, and their institutions are not rude. I mean, rude is indicating that they're not as civilized, they're not as sophisticated, they're not as complex as Western civilization is. And so, let's just let them go out there in the wilderness and they can just be, whatever, right? Well, that is totally not true. Not every native tribe had as organized a constitution or anything like that, like the Cherokees did, but that didn't mean that their institutions were rude, right? It will retard the progress of decay. So part of the problem was that tribes were seeing less and less population. I mean, obviously, they were fighting diseases caused by Westerners coming into contact, and they didn't have any natural immunity to those diseases. Of course, they had been fighting wars, and they were being, murdered, and nobody would care. And so there are a lot of reasons why their populations are decaying, right? And it has nothing to do with them. It's mainly to do with, of course, those external influences, right? So again, the argument there is specious. It's not, if you controlled the whites, then they wouldn't have this problem, right? And perhaps, of course, cause them gradually under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsel. Okay, now wait a second. I thought here that they're free from the power of the states. Free from the power of the states does not mean free from the power of the federal government, right? So this is the thing, right? So they're still going to be under the sway of a government that doesn't like them and wants to basically see them all wiped out, right? It was Jackson, right? And they cast off their savage habits and become interesting. So again, they're not interesting now, they're not civilized now, and of course they're not Christian. Well, that's not true. There were a lot of Native Americans that had converted to Christianity, right? But First Amendment, freedom of religion, they're supposed to be able to worship whatever they wanted, right? And so that's just illogical because it's illegal to force them to be Christians, right? But again, look at the labeling, look at the stereotyping of them as savages and not interesting and not civilized and all of that, right? So you can see that pattern, and you just look for the same patterns going on. And so you can analyze by saying, well, this part of this article's power rests in people's, racism against Native Americans. And then you could just show all the examples of where he's appealing to people's ignorance and racism and prejudice against Native Americans. And that's the only reason why this is working, right? So then he asks us a rhetorical question, and this question actually becomes, so a rhetorical question is a question that you don't need an answer to. The answer is obviously. And again, they're mostly set up as yes, no kind of binary questions. So this is where we have that false dilemma, that either or fallacy, that we're only being given two choices here, and that's a false dichotomy. So false dilemma, false dichotomy, either or fallacy, they're all kind of the same, right? So he says, who would prefer, a prosperous, safe city as opposed to, the wild forest, right? That's kind of basically where he's asking here, right? That they'll be more than, occupy more than 12 million happy people and filled with all the blessings of liberty.